Now, for some people, bank holiday weekends are for going to the beach, hanging out in the cars, eating ice cream, taking the dog for a walk. You know, I'm back at work here because for me, Monday is Monday. It doesn't really matter if it's a bank holiday or not. In fact, I don't even really know why we have bank holidays. What do we have bank holidays for? What are they for? Can you please tell me? Because what? So the bank can have a day off? So the bank doesn't do any business? So the bank can actually have a nice 4-day week? I don't understand why. May Day is meant to be some kind of celebration of unions, right? Some celebration of the working man and woman. All it seems to happen in the rest of Europe is people have riots to celebrate May Day and get smashed around on the head by police with truncheons. I don't know why we have a May Day bank holiday. Can anybody tell me? I'll tell you what, that'll be the first question I put to Dr. Rakib Ehsan, independent expert in British public attitudes, a man that comes on this show on a regular basis, a man who talks a great deal of sense about a great many things. Dr. Rakib, a very good morning to you.
Morning, Mike. How are you?
Yeah, very well indeed. What is the point of a May bank holiday, by the way?
Oh, Mike, I'm past caring. People have asked me in the past. All I say is, you know, idle hands are the devil's workshop. So I just work every day. And I think you like that spirit as well, to be honest. That we have that in common.
Yes, I do. I mean, absolutely right. Because at the end of the day, we live now in a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week society. We expect to be able to access all the things that we want, including television, including music, including our friends, pretty much all the time, anytime we want to talk to them. Why should we not be able to go into a shop on a Monday morning? Because apparently they're all having a day off.
Well, I think for me, Mike, I'm someone. It's a very fast-changing atmosphere. There's all kinds of things going on, and ultimately, I feel that, as you know, with kind of topics that I write about, that things can change very quickly, and I have to respond to that. I almost feel like because that is ultimately my specialism, I have a duty to respond to that, irrespective of what day it is.
Yeah, absolutely right. And you've been a very busy man this year, particularly, Rakib, because there's so much going on. The Sill report that we talked about a couple of times already. You wrote a big piece just recently this weekend for the Sunday Guardian, which I think is an Indian newspaper, about that race report and about some interesting conclusions. Because now that the dust has all settled and everybody's calmed down a bit, we can actually kind of analyse what it said with a bit more kind of calm assurity, can't we?
No, absolutely. And I think that topics relating to racism, they are admittedly sensitive, which is why it's especially important to approach them in a level-headed and mature manner. Unfortunately, Mike, as you saw, many of the reactions to the report did not fall into that territory at all. In fact, I thought it very much fell firmly into hysterical territory, and much of it was racially motivated abuse towards the report authors themselves.
Yes.
So the piece that I authored for the Sunday Guardian, which is a weekly Indian newspaper, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to write for them. It was basically looking at what are the key points of disadvantage in Britain. And something that we've discussed many times before, I do feel there are organizations, journalists, and academics who they deliberately place race at the forefront of these discussions on disadvantage. It might be because they're emotionally invested in peddling a particular interpretation of Britain, which isn't rooted in reality. Or it could even be the case they're actually financially invested in doing so. Because the reality of the matter is, for all its flaws, Britain is a successful multiracial democracy. There's a wealth of survey data which suggests that. You see high levels of patriotism among ethnic minority, non-white groups. There's also high levels of political trust on the whole. And in fact, recent research that I conducted showed that when compared to white people, non-white people are more satisfied with their lives.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, a beacon of hope, you might even say, as the Sill report actually said that Britain was for a lot of other Western democracies. Because you go and see what's going on in France today, in Spain, if you go to Italy, if you go to pretty much any southern Mediterranean country, even Greece, I would suspect is the same. There's an awful lot of racism there compared to what there is here.
I couldn't agree more. So if we talk about France, for example, the military generals submitting a letter which essentially suggested that a military intervention on French soil might be the best way forward to tackle Islamism.
Yeah. I mean, that was an extraordinary story. And we covered that last week because I saw that and I thought, this is a big story. And very few people recognised that it was.
Absolutely remarkable. And what was remarkable, Mike, is that it commanded a great deal of public support. the sentiments of the letter.
Yeah.
And then when that's going on across the channel, when you look across the Atlantic, you see the degree of political polarization there in the United States, bitterly racially divided. Britain, for all its flaws, is fairly well positioned. What I say is we should guard against complacency, see where there are weak points when it comes to how people interact with the state,
Yeah.
especially police forces, how we can create a more stable democracy, but also a democratic system that people can relate to more. I feel that all too often when we look at our political system, there's too many decisions taken at the center. It should be talking about spreading decision-making processes into local communities, because ultimately they're better positioned to make decisions for their own communities. They have that specialist local knowledge. I think all too often their decisions are made at a relatively weak center in London. So I think that those are the kind of discussions we should have. But in terms of the race debate, I'm genuinely of the view that Britain is a relatively successful
Well, it is.
multiracial
I mean, one of the
democracy.
things that you point out in the piece that you wrote at the weekend is that we have an awful lot of mixed race people in this country, which you don't see an awful lot of actually in the United States. I mean, I lived there for 10 years and I know the place pretty well. What you have in America is a whole section of parts of the city, of any part of any city, which are basically ghettos, where only certain communities live. So black people all live in certain communities. Of course, there are some exceptions, but not many. You know, you go to Chicago, the south side of Chicago is very much where black people who are not very well off live. You go to New York City, mostly people of ethnic minority origin live outside of Manhattan. You know, you go to California, look at San Francisco, look at Los Angeles. You know, you have areas, South Central LA, almost entirely a black neighborhood. You know, we don't have that here.
Well, I think that when we're looking at the United States, I almost feel like the United States is sleepwalking back into segregation.
Yeah.
In some ways, it's quite remarkable. I've even seen people suggest that graduation ceremonies should be divided up into different racial groups.
Yeah, amazing, isn't it?
Absolutely.
But this is where the sort of circular firing squad of leftism gets you, doesn't it? Because in the end, they're all actually eating each other, as we've seen. Where you get, for example, the nomination of the first woman of colour to win an Oscar. She's described as a woman of colour, but she's actually ethnically Chinese. Now, I don't know when people from China became women of colour.
Well, I think there with the United States, what you see is people talking about diversity and inclusion, but in reality, they're supporting forms of segregation.
Yeah.
That's what it boils down to. And I do see some of those trends emerging within the British contemporary left as well.
Yes.
There's not much discussion about improving relations between different communities, how we can boost social trust in British society. A lot of the suggestions are fundamentally segregationist. I think we saw that with some of the comments made by the BBC's diversity chief over the programme Luther, where she said that he wasn't authentically black enough because he didn't have enough black friends.
Well, and also because he didn't, I mean, even more ludicrously, that he didn't eat Caribbean food. And you're kind of going, what? That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Why should you have to eat Caribbean food just because you're black?
It's absolutely remarkable. So what you see there's ultimately, they're almost developing an identitarian framework which determines one's racial authenticity, depending on who they're friends with, what their eating habits are, and what their general lifestyle is. And that's the kind of thing that I really don't want to see in Britain. And I'll tell you what, Mike, it's certainly something I don't want to see in the BBC.
No, absolutely right. Let's also talk a little bit about this anti-racism campaign that's currently going on in football. You know, let's all make a stand. Let's not tweet for 4 days. I mean, really? You think that's really going to make a difference? But there is no doubt that an awful lot of footballers are now getting more abuse than they were getting just 10 years ago. Why do you think that is?
I think that social media, in some ways, it can become an absolute cesspit. There's no two ways about it.
It doesn't take long, does it?
No, and I think that what was really good about the Sewell report, it did actually talk about the degree of racially motivated abuse which is taking place on social media now. And I do think that there should be greater action taken by those social media platforms in terms of rooting out that those forms of racism.
Yes.
I think that football itself, I think what you see in football, which you see in other sectors, is you see these gestures, whether it's taking a knee, going off social media for a few days, undertaking unconscious bias training. But people think they do these things and that their job is done when it comes to fighting racism. It's a cop out, Mike, if truth be told.
Yeah, it's a bit
Ultimately, we
like,
have a
because
lot.
when you
Yeah.
say to the Premier League, what did you do about fighting racism? Oh, well, we didn't go on Twitter for 4 days. Great, well done, congratulations. How did that go
No,
for you?
absolutely, and I think you see that trend in society where you see people, indulging in these gestures and thinking that, oh, I've done my bit now. So, but I think when you're looking at the anti-racism movement more broadly in Britain, as we've talked about, Mike, we really need to talk about how we can find common ground in terms of fighting these ills in society. We're talking about, I've even heard things within the anti-racism movement, people suggesting that white people shouldn't even participate in discussions on matters of race, which is just absolutely remarkable. So I think that kind of behavior needs to be rooted out of the anti-racism movement, because ultimately, if you want to build a fairer, more cohesive society, people of all different ethnic and racial backgrounds need to be part of those
Yes,
discussions.
but also, Rakib, apart from the sort of grifters of the world who use race as a way of making money and who are in the race industry, because we both know that that's what there is out there, most people, whether they be white, whether they be minority ethnic, white, whether they be from India, Bangladesh, Jamaica, they're all actually a bit too busy getting on with their lives and making money and trying to make a better life for their kids than they are trying to make sure that, somebody isn't being listened to or somebody isn't being talked to.
No, absolutely. I think that racial identity politics in itself, it's an enterprise where it doesn't many people in ethnic minority communities don't relate to it. They absolutely don't. And I think that ultimately you have these identitarian leftist activists, they exercise a great deal of power and influence within the Labour Party.
Yeah.
It's either the fact that they don't know their own ethnic minority communities very well in terms of the traditional values they hold, their high levels of democratic satisfaction, relatively high levels of trust in public institutions, including the police. It's either they don't know about it or they do know about it, but they're brushing it under the carpet
Yes.
because they want to push forward their own politically motivated agenda. Which the cynic in me suggests that might well be a possibility. So I think that is much of Labour's problem, where there's a mismatch between how they view the country and how traditional Labour voting communities view the country. There's a real detachment between the two.
Yeah.
And I think that's perhaps why Labour is still struggling, even though you talked about earlier about the government's woes. That is why in most of the polls, Labour continue to be marked well behind the Conservative Party.
Well, they do, and they've also kind of nailed their colours to the mast of ethnic minority communities, which I'm sure those communities don't necessarily thank them for. I mean, we saw over the course of the weekend the ridiculous spectacle of a Christian preacher being arrested in Uxbridge for preaching. Now, I haven't seen, like all of these situations, I haven't seen a whole video of it. I've seen a video of him being arrested, which seems ridiculous. I don't know what he said that caused them to think that he had committed some kind of hate crime, but regardless of what he said, I can't imagine it could have been terrible what he might have said. Why are we arresting this guy?
Mike, I have a great deal of respect for our police forces on the whole. The vast majority of British police officers, they prioritise safety and security in local communities. But I do feel there have been certain incidents over the course of the pandemic. There has been a case of over-policing. I don't think that police forces can avoid that, and they need to address that, because the incident that you're referring to, that was a clear case of police overreach.
Yes,
I don't
no
think,
question.
I think most people who are pro-police would probably even be of that view.
Yeah, absolutely right. Now, let's talk about Labour in a broader way as well, because, you would have thought last week, given what was going on around the old Curtain Gate and, Carrie Antoinette and the whole story of Boris Johnson, which I still say is the most ridiculous story that he has managed to get himself involved in over the course of his time, both as Mayor of London and as Prime Minister. What people say to me, it's not a story. Well, it is a story. story because he keeps making it a story by not revealing who it was that gave him the money. But despite all of the stuff that went on, despite Prime Minister's questions, poor old Keir Starmer manages to become even more unpopular in the course of that week. How does that work?
I think that particular situation, to my understanding, the Electoral Commissioner investigating the funding behind it, the refurbishment at 10 Downing Street. What I take issue is that Labour are making it the heart and centre, just before these elections. Ultimately, the biggest argument, the biggest criticism that I've had of Labour in recent times is that they refuse to focus on the bread and butter. Okay, criticise the Prime Minister, let the Electoral Commission get on with their investigation. But what I feel that traditional former Labour voters would like to hear about is how Labour, for example, what kind of policies would they have to help small to medium-sized businesses rebuild after the pandemic? Never mind that. You had Sir Keir Starmer. You saw him there arguing with the pub landlord a few weeks ago, Rod Humphreys, and he ended that exchange by saying, I don't need to take lectures from you over the pandemic. People might want to also hear about, how can we strengthen workers' rights in post-pandemic Britain? How do we boost skills in post-Brexit Britain? How can we expand the supply of affordable housing in many parts of Britain? Those are the kind of... Another one would be the waiting lists we have for the National Health Service, which have developed over the course of the pandemic. Those are the kind of bread and butter issues which I feel many voters in the British electorate would be quite keen to hear about. So, okay, criticise the Prime Minister, that's fine. But this story of the number 10 refurbishment, I think Labour have given it a disproportionate amount of attention.
Yes, but also they've kind of trivialised it in their own way as well. So while they've had the opportunity to nail Boris Johnson over it, they've sort of missed the goal again. They've fired it wide, as they always do.
They're good at that, aren't they?
Oh, they're really good, because instead of keeping the pressure on, poor old Keir Starmer gets told, here's a good idea, get down to John Lewis and let's take a picture of you buying some wallpaper, which completely then trivialised what they were trying to tell us was a massive scandal.
The thing with Sir Keir, he confuses me a bit because he ultimately wants to provide this image of being mature, statesman-like, forensic, meticulous. But increasingly, I'm seeing very little of that from Sir Keir Starmer. Now, he might have some very poor advisors. That may be a genuine possibility.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Judging by some of the Labour Party advisors that appear on Talk Radio, former Corbyn advisor this, former John McDonnell advisor that, there are massive planks, I'm afraid. And it's no surprise that, they weren't able to advise their particular master how to succeed in politics.
I think when we're looking at the Conservative government, I would have to say there are serious questions to be asked in terms of, how competent the government is in a number of public policy areas. The problem that Labour has is that it's not very good at, keeping the government to account. I think that is one of its biggest problems. I think Sir Keir, personally, he's tried to fashion a brand which it's not coming to the fore at all.
No.
And I do feel that much of the advice he's given is probably very poor. And I'll be very interested to see the results of the upcoming elections. I fear that it may not be too good for Labour.
No, I think you may well be right.